They thought air power made the jungle safe. Every day, American aircraft crossed the tree line and turned the ground below into craters. Bombs fell in sticks and clusters. Mortars and artillery followed hour after hour. The map filled with impact marks, red grease pencil circles where the earth had been opened. When the shooting stopped, the bombs stayed. Farmers plowed into them. Children found them in riverbeds. Unexploded ordnance still dots Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Millions of pieces, each capable of killing. International teams now map craters, once plotted by pilots. They dig by hand the same way villagers once did, but this time to undo rather than reuse. For veterans, memory lingers differently. They remember the smell of damp clay and the sound of the probe hitting metal. They remember that some of the enemy's best weapons started in their own hands. During 1969 and 1970, as American withdrawal began, the density of traps increased. The Viet Cong shifted from harassment to area denial. Abandoned fire bases were ringed with salvage bombs to slow reoccupation. When U.S. units returned to clear them, the traps exploded in patterns, one to wound, another to kill the rescuers. Some mines were linked by command wire hundreds of meters long. Others were booby-trapped inside old bunkers, a gift left for whoever came back. The term booby-trap disappeared from reports. Everything became an IED, improvised explosive device. Decades before Iraq or Afghanistan, the template was already there. The enemy had written the manual in Vietnamese mud. Behind every trap was a chain of invisible workers, salvagers moved by moonlight with carts and bicycles. They traded unexploded rounds for rice and salt in black market exchanges run through village cadres. Old women boiled bomb casings to soften paint before cutting. Children sorted detonators by shape. Carpenters built false floors for pressure mines, while mechanics rewound fuses with wire stripped from U.S. field phones. A single 500-pound bomb could yield dozens of mines. A cluster bomb dispenser could arm an entire regiment. Captured documents showed careful accounting. From impact number, 38 recovered 3 nose fuses, 2 intact tails, filler excellent. Every misfire from the sky became a promise to the ground. By late 1968, scientists joined the war under Project Countermine. They developed explosive line charges, thin hoses filled with C4 that could be fired across a suspected area and detonated to clear a lane. The idea worked in theory. In practice, the jungle absorbed the blast. Next came defoliants and gas. Operation Ranch Hand sprayed millions of liters of Agent Orange to strip leaves from trees and expose ground paths. CS tear gas was dropped into tunnel mouths to drive sappers out. It only pushed them deeper. At night, American patrols fired illumination flares and used people sniffers, handheld sensors that detected ammonia from sweat and urine. The devices beeped at random, sometimes reacting to buffalo. Technology kept trying to outsmart patience, and patience kept winning. Fear was the invisible weapon. Patrol leaders began dreaming of tripwires. Men counted their steps aloud, trying to keep rhythm with control. Every sound, frog, branch, whisper, became potential death. Commanders noticed patrol speed dropping by half. Whole battalions slowed, not because they were tired, but because they couldn't trust the ground. The Viet Cong exploited that pause. They planted fake traps, empty holes with wire that led nowhere, just to slow pursuit. They staged ambushes 50 meters beyond those decoys, knowing hesitation created targets. One U.S. colonel wrote, "The mind does not need to explode to succeed. It only has to be imagined." By 1967, more than 20% of U.S. combat casualties came from mines and booby traps. Field hospitals turned into anatomy schools for a new kind of wound. Doctors learned to triage blast trauma fast. Massive hemorrhage, amputation, internal pressure collapse. Helicopters turned 10-minute flights into miracles. A soldier who would have died in Korea lived in Vietnam if he could reach the pad in time. Surgeons remembered the smell of burned explosives mixed with soil and sweat. They removed fragments stamped US 155mm107. They kept the fragments as evidence. Statistics told the story. Every ton of bombs dropped created 1/10 of a ton of unexploded ordnance. By 1969, South Vietnam alone contained hundreds of thousands of buried charges, some armed by accident, others on purpose. The enemy called it harvest season. The United States Army Corps of Engineers became the jungle surgeons. Their job was to open the ground and remove the disease. They built mine detectors from lightweight coils and telescoping poles, but the soil's mineral content screamed false readings. So they turned to animals. Dogs trained in Okinawa learned the smell of explosive residue, yet in Vietnam, the humidity washed away scent. Machines failed, dogs tired, men bled, engineers adapted. They dragged grappling hooks ahead of them on long ropes. If a trap went off, it did so 40 feet away. They crawled on hands and knees, probing with bayonets. Each movement was a negotiation with the unseen. Units created mine-clearing lines 50 meters wide. Nothing inside lived. Flamethrowers, bulldozers, roam plows, massive tractors armored with plates, flattened forest into mud. Even then, new traps appeared the next morning, wired from salvaged shells pulled out of the same ground that had just been leveled. The engineers realized what the enemy already knew. A bomb doesn't die when it hits the ground. It waits. It began after rain. A platoon moved along a hedge of bamboo and cassava toward a hamlet that had been bombed the week before. Craters filled with brown water marked the field like moons. The point man tapped the earth in front of his boots and watched for new soil. Lighter, smoother, not yet settled. He marked a soft patch with a twig and stepped around it. At the first paddy dike, the trail narrowed. The second man saw a wire cross the path at ankle height and stopped the file. The third man traced it to a cluster of leaves, a ration tin, a grenade spoon under tension. They cut the wire, disarmed the grenade, and set it aside. The lieutenant nodded and kept them moving. They reached a break in the trees. The open space looked clean. The point man stepped onto the hard-packed dirt of an old cart path and felt it immediately give, like breath under a rug. He pulled back fast, heart in his throat. The second man slid forward, probed, and hit metal. They found the top curve of a U.S. artillery shell 2 inches under the crust. The fuse cavity had been plugged with a wooden sleeve. A firing pin waited in a bamboo tube lined with shaved explosive. The pressure plate was a section of crate, held level by 2 pegs. The whole device was braced by a root so the force traveled straight down. They backed away the way they had come, retraced every step, then cut a new path through brush to bypass the trail. The platoon breathed again. It felt like winning. 100 meters later, the jungle dipped into a drainage ditch choked with ferns. The point man probed the edge, felt nothing, and stepped into the ditch. The water rippled. A vine tugged. A shape under the far bank blinked dull metal. The world turned white. The charge was built from a cluster, bomb submunition wired to a tin of harvested explosive. It was angled upward, aimed like a shotgun along the ditch. The blast blew dirt and water across the file and tore open 3 rucksacks. 2 men fell and didn't get up. The medic moved on instinct, counting breaths, cutting web gear, packing dressings into wounds that didn't look like anything human. A radio call went out into the sky. The platoon secured the ditch with fire into bamboo, then stopped shooting because there was no one to shoot at. The enemy had left the device before dawn and walked away. 20 minutes later, the helicopter came. It hovered with one skid in the ferns and the other on a root. The crew chief waved the litter team in. The pilot held against the wind that the rotor itself made. The platoon watched until the helicopter lifted with their men inside and disappeared above the trees. Then they started walking again. They had 6 kilometers left, and the light was moving through the canopy in a way that said everything would only get harder. That was a normal day. An infantry company could plan every step and still lose men to the ground. The jungle imposed attacks on movement. A patrol leader briefed the route. Narrow file, 3-pace intervals, eyes on the ground 10 feet ahead. The point man carried a probe, often a bayonet, fixed to a stick, tapping soil at an angle before each step. The second man watched branches and trunks for wire. The third scanned above waist height. Everyone else watched left and right, stakes hidden in grasses, the shine of a tripwire in early light. The drill worked until it didn't. The enemy had adjusted. New traps attacked ankles and holes carved under grass mats. Others hit thighs with upward angled stakes. A favorite was the grenade in a can. A U.S. fragmentation grenade lodged in a ration tin, pin pulled, spoon restrained by a laced cord. Brush across the path masked the trip line. When the cord pulled free, the spoon flew, and 4 seconds later shrapnel tore through ferns and web gear. But the devices built from U.S. bombs were different. When they went off, the shock reminded men of artillery. Pressure blasts crushed lungs. Shards punched through packs, radios, and helmets. One shell under a trail junction could take 4 men at once. Another wired to the axle height of a jeep or armored personnel carrier turned steel into confetti. Engineers called these big mines. Infantry called them by the sound they made, like the end of the world at 30 yards. Landing zones weren't safe either. The enemy learned where helicopters preferred to set down. They salted the approach with salvage bomblets, then linked 3 together under a thin mat. Rotor wash lifted leaves and revealed nothing. The first boot touched. A chain of charges went off in a line and rotors filled with dirt and wire. The reaction was always the same after a blast. Silence, shouting. The medic's bag unrolled, someone on the radio calling dust off, and a lieutenant calculating how to hold a perimeter in a place that suddenly felt wrong to breathe. That was the goal. Traps didn't have to stop a unit. They had to slow it, bleed it, and make every man distrust the ground. The Viet Cong didn't build elegant devices, they built reliable ones. A typical team worked with 3 tools: wire, a hammer, and patience. They removed tail fuses from mortar shells, kept the springs, and saved any striker pins. They learned to substitute bicycle spokes for firing pins and tin can strips for springs. From a rusted artillery shell, they cut a plug, drilled a channel, and inserted a homemade detonator made from shaved explosive match heads and a nail. Tripwires came from American communication line, parachute cord, or stripped telephone cable. Pressure plates were wood, hinges were bamboo. The explosive was whatever they could harvest from a bomb body. Composition powder pressed into a can, gelatinous filler scraped into jars, cluster bomb innards poured into pipes. If the soil was wet, they lined the cavity with tar paper. If it was dry, they packed it tight with clay, and they wrote it all down. Field notebooks passed from unit to unit, simple sketches. 2 fingers depth. Wire length to knee. Use tree root to fix angle. A diagram showed how to tilt a shell at 45 degrees so shrapnel traveled along the path of march. Another showed how to mount a mortar shell in a tree at chest height, wired to a brush-lined trigger. They built command-detonated mines, too. A long wire ran to a hide. A scout waited for silhouettes to enter the pattern. One squeeze of a bicycle dynamo or a hand-crank generator sent current through a primer cap. The charge didn't have to be pretty. It only had to work once. American units named the devices after what they did. Bouncing when the charge jumped on a tether. Toe poppers when they took feet. Whip traps when a bamboo arm swung a grenade into a face. The worst were the big ones the enemy called artillery mines. 100 T-55 millimeter shells buried in a culvert, linked to a pressure board disguised as hard clay. A truck passed. The road rose, then fell back into itself. Most of these charges started life with a U.S. crest stamped into the metal. The scale came first. By the mid-1960s, air operations in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia dropped millions of pounds of ordnance every month. Artillery units along fire bases fired night harassment and interdiction, steady shelling into suspected routes. Not every round exploded, not every fuse armed. In monsoon seasons, bombs hit soft ground and didn't detonate. Others fractured and lay dormant until the soil shifted. Locals learned the timings of the flights. Children could identify aircraft by sound: slow transports, fast jets, the deep note thump of a B-52 far overhead. After the last echo, scavengers moved. Some were Viet Cong. Some were civilians paid in rice or salt. They followed the fresh craters, marked the duds, and worked at night. They knew what to take: tail assemblies for scrap, nose fuses for ideas, the explosive filler for power. They cut sections from aerial bombs with handsaws and heated wire. They tapped explosive powder from shells into wooden bowls and dried it in the sun. They learned to recognize the safe angles and the bad ones. Not everyone survived, but enough did to teach the rest. Within a year, entire districts ran on a salvage economy. The guerrillas didn't need factories. America had already delivered what they needed, one sortie at a time. Then patrols moved in, expecting silence. Instead, the first man in the file felt a tug at his ankle. A wire, a click, the world went white. The explosion wasn't from an enemy factory. It wasn't a captured Soviet mine. It was a charge built from the tail of an American bomb, pulled from the mud, cleaned, wired, and buried again by men who had watched where the craters formed. That was the new rule of the war. Whatever America left behind, the Viet Cong repurposed. Shells that didn't detonate, fuses that failed, bomblets that sank into wet soil. The jungle learned to bite with American teeth, and the soldiers learned that the quiet after a bombardment was the most dangerous sound of all. War always wastes. In Vietnam, it recycled. Every mistake in engineering, every dud shell, every shortcut in manufacturing came back across the line. Technology promised control. The jungle answered with adaptation. A dropped bomb became a trap. A trap became a lesson, and that lesson traveled into every war that followed. You can bomb the earth, one veteran said, but the earth learns faster than you think.